course. I'm Jordan Thomas. I'm a cultural anthropologist and a former hotshot for the United States Forest Service. Hotshots are a specialized group of wildland firefighters, and I am the author of When It All Burns. Everything with fire depends on the conditions it's burning in. The landscape surrounding Los Angeles and much of Southern and Central California is one of the most fire-evolved ecosystems on Earth. It's called a chaparral ecosystem because it's so thick that the Spanish used to have to wear chaps to move through them, which is how it got its name. But it's basically impenetrable. It's not forests like people often think it is. It's brush. But it's a very diverse kind of brush. There's over 200 species of woody plants in chaparral ecosystems. And more than any other plant, or as much as a plant can want anything, these plants want to burn. They actually need to burn to reproduce, and they need to burn hot, and they need to burn fast. So these plants, a lot of them produce flammable wax or resin within their branches, which combusts explosively when they catch. Fire is one of the only forms of decomposition that these ecosystems ever encounter because it doesn't rain very much, and there's hardly enough moisture to allow for much decomposition that way. Until there's a fire, the debris within these ecosystems builds up, and it builds up, and it builds up, and it'll build up for decades until the thicket in the chaparral, it's thick enough to where bears hibernate within it sometimes. These ecosystems are. So there's an enormous amount of biomass to combust. That biomass is full of flammable waxes and resins. So when it combusts, it does so explosively. The seeds, when they sense this fire burning above them, that triggers them to germinate. And they won't germinate unless that happens. So these ecosystems, the ones around Los Angeles and much of Southern and Central California, they've evolved to burn like this every 30 to 100 years. So that's just one tiny example of one ecosystem in California. But most ecosystems have their own uniquely adapted fire ecologies. It's important to think about fire in a plural sense. Fire is not just one single thing that impacts ecosystems equally. Just like water is not one single thing that impacts ecosystems equally. A rain is different from a hurricane, right? And just because a plant needs water doesn't mean it needs a flood. And that's essentially what we're dealing with in California. California is among the most fire-adapted ecosystems on Earth. The majority of its ecosystems depend on certain kinds of fire for their health and for their rejuvenation. But certain kinds of fire is important here. So several centuries ago, most ecosystems in California were receiving the sorts of fire that they need. This means that much more of California was burning then than is burning today every year. Scientific estimates place the amount of acreage burned in California per year several centuries ago to between 6 and 10 million acres. That's a significant percentage of California, such that all of California was burning in cycles of decades. But again, what's important to differentiate here is the fact that California and its landscapes was receiving the types of fire that ecosystems thrived with, which enhanced biological diversity. So approximately double the land was burning every year in California back then, but there were different kinds of fire. So in 2020, it's what's considered the worst fire season on record in California. That was only about 4 million acres in the state, compared to 6 to 10 million acres before Europeans came to California. But the difference is that these 4 million acres, or these fires that we're seeing now, they're more intense, they're more extreme, they're concentrated, and they don't enhance biological diversity. They often wipe out biological diversity or clear such huge tracts of forest that there's no seed sources to bring them back. This is what you see in a lot of the fires in the Sierra Nevada mountains and in the north. But even in the south, in these chaparral ecosystems that we were talking about earlier, there's really rare and unique ecosystems of pine trees at the tops of a lot of these mountains. They depend on fire as well, but they depend on a lighter kind of fire. So when you get more intense burns, oftentimes if these forests, if they haven't been treated with fire beforehand, if they get erased, then there's nothing to bring them back. So I think that's the main difference, is there used to be more fire, but it was a different kind of fire. And it was the kind of fire that enhanced ecosystems, contributed to biological diversity. And we're seeing less fire now, but it's a more destructive kind of fire. I think the most important thing with talking about these different kinds of fire and the amount of land that used to burn is the fact that these fires weren't natural in the sense that we often think about nature. There's some terminology here. It's called a fire regime, and that's the patterns of fire that landscapes have evolved to experience and thrive with. So when you talk about fire regimes, you're often dealing with natural fire regimes like lightning. California is a really unique case because the fire regimes in California are considered cultural fire regimes, which means that people were the ones lighting the fires for most of California's human history for around 10,000 years. So indigenous people in California were the ones lighting all of these fires that were burning so much of the state. And indigenous people in California were burning the state for enough years to where the landscape and the ecosystems adapted to it and evolved to it and actually came to depend upon this human source of fires. But again, fire is plural. It's hard to talk about one kind of fire or one kind of burning because each different group of people in California, there were around 200 different indigenous languages spoken in California, so hugely diverse people had different methods of burning, had different reasons of burning, and different ways of burning. There's a saying in California that pyrodiversity is tied to biodiversity. And what this essentially means is that a lot of different types of landscapes need a lot of different kinds of fire. And so you need people who understand the landscapes and to such a degree and who understand fire to such a degree to where they can give the landscapes the types of fire that they need. For around 10,000 years before Europeans colonized California, indigenous people were burning between 6 to 10 million acres per year in California. So why were they doing that? The simplest way to understand that is because California's plant types depend so much on fire that indigenous people used fire to facilitate the types of plants that they needed and they thrived with, often for food systems. And there's a couple different levels of this. So where I live in Santa Barbara, for example, there's a plant, type of plant with protein-rich seeds called, it's a type of chia grass, and it needs fire to grow. So people would burn, indigenous people, the Chumash people in the area that I live, would burn to facilitate wild rye. Acorns are often a big food staple from oak trees, all different types of oak trees all throughout the state. Fire is really important for those too, for multiple reasons, because you can clear the duff, this thick layer of soil from the base. And that means that when the acorns drop, there's not as many insects to eat them quickly, but the smoke also clears different parasites from the acorns. So there's a plant called soaproot where I live. Again, this is all just in one tiny little area. And it depends upon fire as well. And when you get soaproot and you pound its roots and then you sprinkle those roots into the water, it paralyzes the fish temporarily. So then you can just harvest some of the fish. But then if you also burn in an area to produce a meadow or to maintain a meadow, that enriches the grass because it releases a lot of nutrients from the cellulose. And that attracts different game animals like elk and deer for hunting. So really at every level of food systems in California, fire was important. Not only important, but these food systems wouldn't exist without it. And so that's just a couple plants within one tiny region of California. There's about 200 other plants within this region that depend upon fire. And then take that and apply that to all these other regions. You start to understand how important fire is for the plant communities, how important the plant communities are for the human communities. Fire started initially being put out through the criminalization of indigenous food systems by criminalizing their burning practices. This originated with the first governor and this first Spanish governor in California in 1793 in Santa Barbara, Jose Joaquin de Arriaga. He banned indigenous burn practices based on the premise that they were destructive and the people burning were childish. So what this effectively was, it was a misunderstanding, sure, but what was fueling that misunderstanding? What was fueling that was the colonial imperative to dominate and subjugate these people in these colonial regions. And how do you do that? You take away their food systems. How do you do that? You take away their fire. So that was the origin of the loss of the fire that California's landscapes depended upon. The United States essentially replicated this system when they took over California in the middle of the 19th century. In the first legislative session, they banned indigenous burning, and they called for the genocide of indigenous peoples. And these two things really went closely together, the attempt to dominate indigenous people and the attempt to put fires out. I think it's just very important to tie the human history of fire in California's ecosystems to the history of fire suppression, because it means that it's not just some accident or some historical quirk, but there's real power dynamics involved there in the foundations of our society, and we have to address those if we're gonna ever try to fix the problem. A lot of histories locate the origins of fire suppression with the foundation of the United States Forest Service in 1905. It's important to recognize that by the time the U.S. Forest Service was established, most of the fires in California had already been put out by criminalizing indigenous fire use, because indigenous people were lighting most of those fires. What the U.S. Forest Service did was they institutionalized fire suppression, and they put the weight of the federal government behind it. Now, why did they do that? This was part of a conflict back at the beginning of the 20th century about what these landscapes were for. With the expansion of American capitalism into the American West at the time, a lot of people thought that these landscapes were for extraction and to exploit the resources, to take the timber out. So the U.S. Forest Service originated as an attempt to protect what a lot of people imagined as a wilderness. And I say imagined because, as we've already talked about a little bit, this wasn't a wilderness. This was a landscape that had been tended by people using fire for many, many years. So what they did was they said they're protecting the land from fire, right? That's a much easier imperative to get the public behind. That was mostly in name only until the second chief of the Forest Service. He helped fight a really catastrophic fire in which a lot of people died in the early 1900s. So he had a tough relationship with fire, and he also had a close relationship with the logging industry. So at the time, the U.S. Forest Service was being starved of funds, so he had the brilliant idea of partnering with the logging industry and then essentially using the U.S. Forest Service as a public subsidy to protect forests so that they could be logged. You got a lot more funding for the Forest Service, but you also got a lot of the forests of the American West logged. Now, why is this pertinent for the growth of the fires today? Well, what happens after you log a forest creates one of the most flammable landscapes that you could possibly create. And when I talk about this form of logging, I'm talking about the form that they did in this time period, which is clear cutting, which is where you essentially denude a mountain of all of its trees. And then you replant that mountain with whatever tree is the most valuable at the time. And you do so in a way to maximize the profit you can make from it, which means you're planting the most valuable species really close together. All the same species, all the same age, clumped. This creates a catastrophic fire environment for multiple reasons. Number one, they're so close together that they're less healthy because there's less access to things like water. Number two, if we talk about what shapes fire behavior, it's the landscape that shapes the fire behavior largely. And when you have a diverse landscape, you get diverse fire types. So think of a fire moving through a forest, and then it hits a meadow, so it drops down to the meadow, and then it creeps through the meadow, and then it might stop because there's a watershed or something. Well, when you get miles and miles and miles of one species of tree, a lot of those trees dead because they're really unhealthy, the fire gets in the canopy, and then it just runs and it runs and it runs for over 1 million acres at some points now with these fires that we're seeing. There's quite a few places in California where if you stand on a mountaintop and you look out at the wilderness, you think you're seeing wilderness. It looks like wilderness. You imagine that it's wilderness. Well, really what you're seeing is the history of logging. And a lot of them are essentially old pine plantations. The foresters call them pines in lines that were planted back in like the 1930s. So these would be really flammable and really dangerous on their own. Layer climate change on top of that, and you're just changing the entire equation because these already vulnerable, unhealthy ecosystems are placed under unprecedented catastrophic stressors, which is just the perfect storm for the kinds of fires we're seeing today. There's multiple things that we can do to try to rebuild a healthy relationship with fire in California and everywhere, really. Number one, we have to stop burning fossil fuels on a scientific timeline because there is no forest management strategy or land management strategy that will matter if we keep burning fossil fuels at our present rate. I think it's just always so important to start with that. The second thing to do is to start reintroducing the kinds of fires that our landscapes need. and bringing these fires back. At a local level, there's an effort to create these things called prescribed burn associations in California. And these are groups of people who they work together, they figure out what kinds of fire the landscapes need, they figure out what their goals are, they try to increase biological diversity, or they try to decrease fire hazards, and they go out and they burn when the conditions are correct. So this is great, but this mostly happens on private land. But what's important to think about in California is how you can burn these different types of land. So it's one thing to burn on private land. The state's doing a pretty good job burning on state land. But I think the elephant in the room when you're talking about fire in California is that around half of California's land is federal land. So it's federally managed. So it depends upon federal funding to be able to put these fires on the ground. That's really important to think about, especially when you hear federal officials, such as the president, talking about things like forest management. That topic, that area is within their control. So I think one of the things that you can do is get active in whatever way you can to build a relationship with fire, which involves building a relationship with your community, which involves building relationships with your ecosystems, but also just being aware that this is a problem that does matter and is impacted by things like federal elections. And it needs funding from federal people. And it's not just funding for projects, for forest management projects. That's important. But it also means putting money into the people carrying out those projects. One of the biggest issues in California with getting more prescribed burns done on federal lands is the fact that there's money for the projects, but there's often not enough people with the skills needed to carry out those projects, because that requires an enormous amount of experience to be able to burn in a way that's safe, right? And to be able to know enough about the local ecology to be able to put those kinds of burns on the ground in a way that's beneficial. But due to lack of benefits, low pay, by the time people get those levels of experience, they often leave the job. So one really important thing that should be done is increase in funding for local communities to have groups of people who understand the ecology and have a relationship with fire to work in these sorts of ecosystems.